Well, welcome back to Face the Nation, and we have a lot to talk about with our panel this morning. We're starting in Sochi and going to Iran and Syria and all the developments back here at home. Joining us this morning, Jeffrey Goldberg with the Bloomberg View and the Atlantic, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times correspondent Mark Mazzetti, who covers national security, the author of The Way of the Knife, the CIA, a Secret Army, and a War at Ends of the Earth. And we're also joined by CBS News State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan and our own John Dickerson. John, I will start with you. So Eric Holder makes a speech last night to a gay rights group where he announces new changes. Here's part of what he said last night in this speech.
In every courthouse, in every proceeding, and in every place where a member of the Department of Justice stands on behalf of the United States, they will strive to ensure that same-sex marriages receive the same privileges, the same protections, and the same rights as opposite-sex marriages under federal law.
So I guess one of the things this means, if you get arrested and hauled into federal court, your partner cannot testify, as it is with heterosexual couples who are married. A wife can't testify against a husband against a wife. But is there anything else that this covers? This does not seem to cover a great number of people to me.
No, that's right. It also covers things like visitation rights in prison. So the Attorney General said in every instance where the Justice Department is acting, same-sex couples will be treated the same as opposite-sex couples. This also has to do with things like survivor benefits for first responders. There's some 9/11 first responder survivor benefits that are involved here. But this is under the overall effort by this administration in ways big and small to include marriage equality in the March of Civil Rights. Remember in the president's inaugural address for his second term, where he talked about and included the gay rights movement as a part of the Great American Civil Rights March. And I think that's a part of this. The really interesting thing to watch, though, is will the president, through executive action, change the way in which federal contractors treat same-sex couples, people with different gender orientation. That's something he's been pressured to do. If he did that on his own, that would be a very interesting political move. It would create a lot of heat, but it would also be something that he's been pushing for and a lot of Democrats have been pushing for.
You know, we heard both Peter King, the congressman from New York, a Republican, and then you later heard Kelly Ayotte, the fairly moderate Republican senator from New Hampshire, saying she thought there might actually be some pushback on that, and she and Peter King both talk about what they call a lack of confidence that's growing among Republicans against the president, almost suggesting perhaps that the speech, when he talked about doing these things by executive order if he can't get the Congress to go along with him, has backfired or may backfire. Do you get any sense of that, Jeff?
Well, I think it's unfair to say that this is a new phenomenon. I don't think that the Republicans before the speech had great faith in the president, bipartisan reach out. I don't think the White House has that feeling. So I think that that speech might have backfired a little bit because it gives Republicans the excuse to not listen even more. There was an interesting moment last week. The president visited Michigan and he was talking about bipartisan efforts, and not a single Republican came out to even be seen near him. I thought that was a moment.
This was when he went to Michigan to sign the Farm Bill,
right,
which was agreed to bipartisan, one of the few bipartisan things that's done lately. They invited a host of Republicans to come. Not a single Republican was willing to go out there, John.
When I talk to Republicans about when they say they don't trust the president, there are a lot of reasons they don't trust him. But the first thing they bring up is health care, as Senator Ayotte did today. And that is all these changes the president has made, which they think, some of the things he's done when he talks about taking executive actions, pretty small stuff. It doesn't trample the Constitution. What they say is trampling the Constitution is when he changes a law that's already passed through what he says is his own authority. And so they always go back to health care. Why? Because A, for them, it's a legitimate beef, but B, secondly, it's because they want to talk about health care for this entire election year.
Let me turn to you, Mark. Your newspaper has a very interesting story about Edward Snowden today on the front page. It said he used a tool called the scraper to get some of this in whatever the scraper is. I don't know. Maybe you can explain what. Can you buy a scraper at your local department
It
store?
turns out you can actually get it far more easily than you might think, and not that everyone could do what Edward Snowden did, but the story shows that just how ill-prepared the NSA was for someone like Snowden. I mean, here we were a couple years after Manning and the release of documents through WikiLeaks. And here's the most secure, what we thought was the most secure American intelligence agency. For Snowden to be able to do that is incredible. And as the intelligence chiefs admitted this week, they're learning as much about what Snowden took from the press stories as from their own investigation. They still don't have a clear sense of the entirety of what he took.
You know, there has been some talk, and I've heard this talk. Peter King said he'd heard it, that he's been unable to substantiate it at this point, that Edward Snowden actually decided to go to Hawaii because he knew somehow that the security there was not as good. Now, as I say, this is totally unsubstantiated, but it is one of the things that King said as part of the ongoing investigation, that he knew the security wasn't as good out there. Well, it turns out it was not nearly as good as it is elsewhere.
And I've heard that as well. And what we do know is that when, after WikiLeaks, after Manning, the NSA did try to sort of batten down the hatches and make things more secure. They were doing it at the headquarters at Fort Meade first, and in other facilities. Out in Hawaii, where Snowden was, that software was not in place, the security was not in place. Whether he knew that or not, certainly, several of us have heard that. As it turns out, it was not at all secure, and he was therefore allowed to do what he did.
Do you have you picked up anything to suggest? Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, said he believes that the Russians helped Snowden. Are you getting anywhere on that?
No. I mean, I've never, there's allegations about Russian and Chinese help. I've never heard anyone to confirm that, or I've never seen any evidence, but it's out there because the government continues to make these charges.
You know, this impulse to blame the Russians or blame other parties, I think, stems from the disbelief, you know, that one man can do this with programs that you can download over the internet. And it's interesting because, you know, this whole story is, we talk about it in a kind of a binary fashion. On the one hand, there's the civil liberties concerns. On the other hand, there's the national security concerns. But we're not talking very much about the stupendous incompetence of an intelligence apparatus that allowed a guy to take everything, essentially, without anybody knowing it. And that's what this story in the Times this week, I think, suggests, which is that he was robbing the pantry blind.
You know, Margaret, I want to ask you about this, because while we're talking about the NSA and who it's monitoring and who it's not and whether it ought to be reined in, guess what? It turns out the Russians haven't reined in their abilities very much, as the State Department found, much to its embarrassment this week. The Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, I guess, Victoria Nuland, was having quite a conversation, not exactly in diplomatic language. Here's a portion of it.
That would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
Bleep the EU, that was the European Union. This was not taken diplomatically, shall we say, by the Europeans, especially the Germans. What was this all about, Margaret? And I'm not going to ask you to repeat the quote, but what was she talking about?
Well, and I'm sure none of us have ever used that word before. But no, the context to this was this frustration. And I spoke to Victoria Nuland just today about what continues to be a lot of concern that there is real violence about to break out on the streets of the Ukrainian capital right now because of this standoff. Back when this was recorded, it was recorded off of an open line with the U.S. ambassador, unencrypted. It was picked up and the White House points out, tweeted out by someone in the Russian government. So that's what's leading to this.
So we think the Russians did it.
At least that they promoted it.
Yeah.
No one quite said who recorded it, but the Ukrainian and Russian intelligence arms seem to be
Well,
sort
why
of
were
one
they
and the
talking
same.
on an open line? I mean,
well, what Tori Newland will lay out for you is that the U.S. was working with the opposition at the time, at their request, to try to take up the Ukrainian president on his offer to put some members inside of this government in a technical way to try to quell some of this standoff. And they haven't really resolved anything for the broader issue. But when she said, let's try to get the UN to glue it together, it was the EU wasn't working fast enough to fix this problem in their own backyard of Europe. They were turning to the UN to try to stand in there to help quell some of the violence that was in the streets and to try to address some of the human rights concerns. And it was more in the sense of, we don't need the EU to get this done, rather than anger at them.
What does this conversation, has it had an impact on relations with the EU, as it were?
It's embarrassing. And I think, as you
Germans
saw,
certainly didn't like it.
and that was interesting to have the German Chancellor release that comment saying how inappropriate this was. Angela Merkel's very conservative. She's very careful. She wanted that out there. But Toria Nuland has apologized and moved on. We're still working with the EU to get this done. So it hasn't damaged things on that extent, but it has appeared
I would
to be
guess it hasn't
undiplomatic.
helped.
And just remember, this is against the backdrop of Merkel being infuriated that the NSA was listening
Yes.
to her conversation. So this is just, it's a game, and it's just, they get a chance to sort of stab back a little bit. Germany's going to take the opportunity to point this out.
And
There
was
was one German politician who said something like, well, this just goes to show that all surveillance is bad.
Well, there was also a recording of EU officials, Cathy Ashton and one of her deputies, complaining about the U.S. that was also released. So
The safest rules don't say anything about anything ever, right? I mean, if you're a diplomat, certainly on an open line.
All right. We're going to take a break here, and we'll come back with more uncensored Face the Nation. We had a vote during the commercial break about whether we should talk first about international and or domestic policies first. International won, but we're going to start with domestic policy. We respect the majority here, as they do in the minority, as they do in the U.S. Senate. John, what happens now on immigration and the debt limit?
Well, if we start on immigration, John Boehner came out this week and said, it seemed like he was trying to position things so that in the House, where immigration, it's a bipartisan bill passed the Senate, the question was what's going to happen in the House. John Boehner, they put forward some principles in Republican leadership a week ago that suggested things might be inching towards progress. This week, John Boehner said, no progress because my members don't trust the president. Well, yes, they don't trust the president. We've talked about that. But there's also the fact that in the Republican conference, they don't trust the government. You hear them talk a lot about
Well, they
this.
don't trust John Boehner.
Well, that's right, and he recognizes that. And but also there's a war inside the Republican Party over this question of immigration, and he got a lot of heat in the week between when they announced these very vague principles and the week when he said we're not going to go very far. He got a lot of heat from those conservatives, and they don't want to have a big inter-party fight. One, they can be having an election about other things, namely the failure of the president's health care plan, which is what they'd like to talk about. And so they say it's trust, but it's a lot of other issues as well. And it means that it's unlikely we're going to get very far on immigration. Although, in calling to Democrats and people who want to get some immigration reform passed this year, a lot of people were a little reserved in attacking John Boehner. They said, we think he actually does want to try and get something moving forward. We recognize this as something he's got to do he's got to tell his conservative members, look, I'm not rushing to get a bill through here. So they see it as a part of kind of membership maintenance. On the debt limit, that's a thing he's got to get over first. And that's a fight with his own conference, but it's going to pass somehow.
I do not believe that the Republicans will want to take the blame for shutting down the government yet again. And so I agree with you. I think that, I don't know how they're going to do it, but I think they'll pass the debt limit.
Why would you want to be blamed for hurting the economy when you can blame Obamacare for hurting the economy? I mean, in other words, they're riding from their perspective a good issue, and nobody wants to put themselves in the position where they're going to be blamed for shutting down the government, hurting the economy. So it makes sense to pass it and keep the focus on Obamacare.
I want to ask you, and I can start with you, Margaret, and everyone is welcome to join in. There was this extraordinary set of hearings, things that are usually fairly routine on Capitol Hill, and that was confirmation of ambassadors. And the administration sent some people up to the Senate to be confirmed, who turned out, one, did not know what form of government the country he was going to represent the United States in, did not know what form of government they had. It just seemed like they had sort of lived someplace else and were suddenly being sent off to these places that they'd never been and didn't know anything about. Is the administration worried about this? I mean, I would think this would be something that president would be kind of embarrassed about, to say the least.
Well, they've gotten hit in the press, so there's some concern about it. But this has been a problem for years that career Foreign Service officers, and certainly the union that represents them, have raised as an issue. Thomas Pickering, a very prominent diplomat, has complained about this, saying there aren't enough career diplomats getting these key posts. Often, what they don't put in there, but what people on the political side will say is these jobs are going to people who are bundlers for campaigns, who are getting rewarded for financial
Which is what
donations.
these people were, for the most
Exactly,
part.
and that.
I mean, the fact is there have been some very outstanding ambassadors who were not Foreign Service members. Avril Harriman, people of that nature come to mind, and there always have been, and there will always be a place. Some countries don't want Foreign Service officers.
Right.
They want someone who's close to the president, but this seems far different from anything that I've heard of lately around
Well, that
here.
coverage this week, particularly around the nominee to be the ambassador to Argentina, got a lot of press and pushback from the Argentine government because there had been the remark that he never traveled there and didn't have some of the knowledge. But what the administration would say is you represent the U.S. abroad, and we're going to brief these people.
I think he's been to an Argentine steakhouse, but that was about his level of experience. But you have the Norway story where the guy didn't know that there was a monarch ruling Norway. He called it a president. You have in Hungary. I mean, we know now that the price. What it would cost to get an ambassadorship, about $500,000 in bundled money, because they're sending a soap opera producer to be ambassador to Hungary who doesn't know why, can't define the nature of the relationship between Hungary and the United States. Forget that they don't know the languages or have been to these places. I mean, they can't even define why this place might be important to the United States. So it is fairly embarrassing.
It used to be something you went overseas after college. It shouldn't be a perk of becoming an ambassador. But the money point here is crucial as we get into another presidential season, which they never seem to stop. But there are people out there who are raising lots of money for candidates in the hope that they're going to get put in one of these jobs. And it goes back to the influence of money in politics.
It's not the worst thing in the world that this becomes an issue. I mean, I think it's embarrassing for the administration, but it's important that it shows sort of this behind the scenes how people get ambassador jobs. And there are great ambassadors out there, but they're also, you should do your homework. I don't think you have to have gone to the country before becoming the ambassador, but you should do your homework. You should read the paper.
Kind of know where it is.
You should know where it is. Yes, you should know. You should know the type of government it has.
But look at how celebrated Caroline Kennedy is as the new ambassador to Japan right now. She's not a career Foreign Service officer, but exactly as you say, it's that proximity to the president
She's also
that
made a
people
couple
see.
of very controversial statements.
She has, but she can pick up the phone and call the president, and for the receiving country, that's important.
Let's talk about Syria. What bad stuff going on there?
It continues to get worse when you didn't think it could, and it stays out of the news at times, but the war doesn't end. And sort of, I think the last time a lot of Americans checked in was last summer, fall, when President Obama was threatening military strike after a chemical weapons attack, pulled back after going to Congress, or saying he was going to go to Congress, and then they struck this deal for chemical weapons, that Assad was going to give up his chemical weapons. Well, since we last checked, he hasn't been doing that. He's missed deadlines, and the war continues, and there's this real question in the administration. Well, what do we do now? I mean, we've sort of taken back this thread of force. How do you gain leverage over Assad? The last round of talks that happened in Geneva really didn't go anywhere. And so they're going back in the administration to this question of, well, what can we do? What are our options? Because there's still this impulse on Obama's part not to get involved.
Right, and the nature of the story has changed in the last couple of weeks, in fact, because the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, a couple of weeks ago on the Hill in open testimony, said that they have some proof that some of the al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Syria that are fighting the Assad regime have the aspiration of attacking U.S. targets. So this story is moving out of the humanitarian catastrophe column or the this is bad for our regional allies column into a kind of pre-9/11 Afghanistan story. It's like al-Qaeda is operating here and thinking about hurting Americans. Well, then you have a whole set of other options that you're going to have to contemplate, because that's a direct national security threat. And we haven't really been talking about that very much.
Yeah,
and it's going to surprise people.
The new Homeland Security Chief connected those dots, saying that there is a perceived threat to the homeland because of some of these foreign fighters in Syria possibly coming back here. Recruits who went, it's become a magnet for extremists, and there could be some reverberations back here.
And some news from Iran.
Yes, the The Iranian Navy is approaching the shores of the United States. It's like that old movie, The Russians Are Coming, I think. There's different factions in Iran. Some are trying to continue their charm offensive in advance of the upcoming nuclear negotiations. Someone in the Iranian government decided it would be a good idea to send a destroyer, an Iranian destroyer, to approach the coast of the United States.
What?
Yeah, and I think this destroyer it's an old refurbished American destroyer. I don't know where it is or if this is actually happening, but they've made this quote-unquote threat. I think Iran undermines its image if Americans get a glimpse of the Iranian Navy, because there's a couple of old rickety boats that the average fisherman, charter fisherman out of Key West can probably handle. But they believe that America shouldn't be in the Gulf. And therefore, it's a sort of a tit-for-tat thing. We're going to send our Navy to your shores to show you that we mean business, but it doesn't exactly threaten the
I
national
hope
security
you'll
of the
keep
United
us
States.
informed when you see
I'm
it.
going to go out. I'm getting on a Boston whaler and going to approach them and see what happens.
All right. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you a lot for some very serious things we talked about this morning. Some maybe not quite that serious, but fun to have you here, and hope you'll come back. We'll be back in a minute. I'll have some thoughts about my old friend Marty Plissner.